More importantly, though, I've listened to many people in my community whose views I respect, even though some I may not agree with. Many people I've spoken with have had very personal stories about the death of a loved one, and many still bear the pain and grief of seeing a loved one suffering. And I want to especially acknowledge all of those people and those who shared their intensely personal experiences with me over the last few months. The fundamental reason why I'm supporting this legislation is that it provides people with choice. It provides people with control over the manner in which they will die, the time when they will die, and where they will die, when they're suffering from a life-limiting disease and the suffering is intolerable. It puts the person at the centre of decision-making about their life and their death. The title of the legislation, Voluntary Assisted Dying, reflects the core of what the legislation is about, enabling people to seek assistance to end their lives at a time they choose when faced with the likely probability of death within 12 months for neurodegenerative diseases and 6 months for other conditions, and who are experiencing suffering which is not tolerable for them. In my view, it is assisted dying and not euthanasia, because it is a decision made by the person. Now, there may be an arguable point in those circumstances where a third party has to physically assist with medication, but critically, the person receiving the medication is still capable of deciding their future and exercising a choice. It is a decision of the person. It must be voluntary, and it must be enduring over time. It is a decision that can be withdrawn by the person should they choose. It's an intensely personal decision, which should be made in a climate of compassion and acceptance. And I know that for some who are family and friends of the person at the centre of this decision, it may be very difficult for them to accept. So I support this legislation because of my belief in a person's ability to make a decision that is the right decision for them, a decision that they are deemed legally competent to make with full knowledge of the implications of the decision, and a decision that is not subject to coercion by a third party. And this is a belief that is shared by many in my community, but not all. Tomorrow I will table a petition from over 200 people who do not support this legislation, and I will do so respecting their views and their right to be heard in this place. Amongst other things, the petitioners are concerned about the possible extension of choice to the notion that eventually assisted dying would be a choice made by others, and that it would be a commonplace as an option for those who are mentally ill or the elderly, that economic decisions in relation to the cost of health care might drive expansion of the legislation in the future, and that the legislation might lead to circumstances where the community's trust in health professions could be diminished. The petitioners also stated their concern about the adequacy of palliative care, which is a topic I will come back to in detail. Now, I do not share that fear that this legislation is a slippery slope, that it will open the door to reducing safeguards or that it would lead to mistrust. There are 102 components in the legislation that are intended to safeguard the decision-making process, including oversight of each individual decision, designed to ensure that the person remains at the centre and the person remains in control. I know that there are many in my community who believe the legislation does not go far enough, and that the ability to request an assisted death should be included in an advanced care directive, and that details the circumstances under which a person wishes their life to end. There are others who've expressed a view that next of kin should be able to request an assisted death on behalf of their loved one if they are no longer capable of making that request. As a parliamentarian responsible for contributing to the consideration of this bill, I thought about these limitations carefully, and I have come back to the firm view that a person must have the legal capacity to request an assisted death, and this request must be enduring right to the end. Removing the requirement of legal competence at the point when a person wishes to take the medication leaves the final decision about when a person's life will end to a third party. And even though the decision may be in accordance with a previous expressed wish, the person no longer has voluntary control of that decision, and that makes a difference for me. The broader eligibility requirements of this legislation also mean that it cannot simply be extended to the mentally ill or to the elderly. It is firmly based on the notion that a person is facing a life-limiting disease and the associated suffering as defined by them cannot be relieved. So aside from other eligibility criteria, the core of this legislation is a juxtaposition of, on the one hand, an enduring decision by a legally competent person, and the other circumstances where life is limited due to disease and the suffering is intolerable as defined by the person. The notion of choice, though, does require people to have access to full information about the options that are available to them both through palliative care and end-of-life care, and it embodies a notion of what is a good death. Personally, I think a good death is one that is a long way off, but the reality is we will all die, and some of us here will know that we will have a finite lifespan at some point. It is time we talked about what a good death really means, and that can be tough. Emeritus Professor Ian Maddox, Senior Australian of the Year in 2013, made the observation, sometimes I think it is better to step back and say you don't need all that procedural stuff. What you need is good care now. You're going to die, let's do it well. This concept of dying well is a common thread that ties end-of-life choices together, and I want to use the remaining time to explore that concept. The Australian Institute of Health and Welfare describes 7 features of dying well, and they include being cared for and dying in a place of one's choosing, involvement and control in decisions about care, access to high-quality care given by well-trained staff, and access to the right services when they're needed, and support for one's physical, emotional and spiritual needs, and wanting the right people to know my wishes at the right time. I want the people who are important to me to be supported and involved in my care. Pretty basic principles. Dying well means a person is at the centre of those principles. The person has control of what is happening to them, understands what is happening, and has access to information. Care is determined by the person in partnership with healthcare practitioners, family, and significant others. And assisted dying provides an expansion of those choices available to a person that complements their choices within a palliative care framework. It is not a case of one or the other. It is a case of a person being at the centre, defining their end-of-life pathway in order to define what is a good death for them and not a good death as some other person views it. This pathway can be different for each person. The Australian Institute of Health has described 3 patterns of life-limiting illness. The first is characterised by a short period of decline, where bodily functions decline rapidly with no sign of recovery, and a relatively short period between onset and death, found in many cancer conditions. The second results in long-term limitations with intermittent serious episodes, and there is a slower decline with intermittent sudden declines and longer periods between onset of the disease and death, and found, for example, in heart and lung conditions. And finally, there's a prolonged pattern of decline with loss of bodily function over an extended period found in diseases such as dementia. And each of these would result in different patterns of care response, and the latter group may well not meet the excess eligibility requirements for voluntary assisted dying. But what these patterns highlight is that choice in regard to care implies having access to viable options, and some of these are determined by the nature of the disease itself. For most people, their wish is to die at home, surrounded by loved ones. The Productivity Commission in a recent inquiry noted that accurate data about how many people actually died at home was limited because people's wishes change over time, and these changes are not captured by the surveys. But generally, the research estimates that up to 70% of Australians would prefer to die at home. The reality is very different, with estimates that only about 14% do so, and the majority actually end up in a hospital setting. This is a pretty significant statistic, with the majority of people ending up dying in circumstances different from what they would have wished for. And at the beginning of the 20th century, death and dying was very much a family and community matter. But today, with advances in medicine, the end-of-life experience has been increasingly institutionalised in hospital settings, notwithstanding excellent care and support. And as the number of older people increases over the next 25 years, we're likely to see that trend increase. Community-based hospice care is a good option, but is limited and in regional WA difficult to access. In addition, costs are significant, even though research by Silver Chain shows that HCS recipients had on average 8% fewer emergency department admissions and spent 5 days less time in hospital in the last year of life, with a greater probability of death occurring at home. I saw the challenges of dying at home firsthand when two friends, Peter and Helen. Helen had been battling cancer for a number of years and eventually went into palliative care at St John's in Bunbury. Her overwhelming wish was to die at home with family. Helen had major problems with mobility, so needed constant nursing care to achieve dying at home. Towards the last few days of Helen's life, the palliative care unit provided a lone hospital bed and equipment to enable Helen to relocate to home, and family and friends came in to support Peter, her husband. Helen achieved her wish, but in that last few weeks, their lives as a couple was dominated by negotiating palliative care pathways that were difficult, not patient-centred and expensive, and resulted in Peter receiving serious injury from heavy lifting that required extended time off work. This was a family in desperate need of support and found it largely through family and friends, but a palliative care system that embraces community networks would have done so much more to make this family's experience of loss much more bearable. I support assisted dying legislation, but I also support a view that we need to rethink palliative care and end-of-life care if we're going to maintain genuine quality options to support people make end-of-life choices. And quality palliative care is not simply about throwing more money into the system, which is increasingly providing an institutional response to a person's end-of-life needs. We need to rethink palliative care as a public health issue and revisit the role of primary healthcare systems as well as acute hospital systems. We cannot see palliative care solely in the context of professional symptom management and professional nursing management. It's also about how we mobilise social assets at a community level to make sure that supports are in place for the person and their family between periods of episodic care, and enable people who are dying to be supported by the people who are closest to them. A recent report from the University of Sydney described the networks and relationships that surrounded people who died at home and the struggle between interface between professional and non-professional networks. But groups here in WA, such as Solaris Care and Dots Place in my own community, are good examples of how community assets can be mobilised in support of people and coexist with medically based palliative care. There are two questions behind the notion of rethinking a community-based approach to palliative care. First, what work currently carried out by professionals could be performed within the community? And secondly, what solutions would professionals come up with to provide care for a person who lives remotely from a service centre? The answer to these questions are most likely going to involve social and psychological support needs, how we provide physical care, and the future role of palliative care nursing, particularly in remote areas. What is clear is that palliative care, as it meets increased demand, has to engage with community and mobilise community assets. It cannot simply just be a replication of hospital palliative care beds and specialised clinicians. Based on naturally occurring community networks, especially in regional WA that exist amongst friends, family, neighbours, local government, business groups would be a key step forward. But building these networks will mean that communities have to start talking about death and dying as part of community life, and that's something we're not really used to doing. In Bunbury, the Compassionate Communities Network has been established to help build a community conversation about death and dying and about advanced care planning, and creating a better understanding that dying is a part of living and what a good death might be. Helping to define death and dying and caregiving as social matters with medical aspects rather than a medical problem with social aspects. The ability to mobilise practical and social support within the community at the end of life should be a high priority in building long-term sustainability in palliative care and end-of-life care and better outcomes for families and individuals. One of the counter-arguments to assisted dying that has been articulated is a need for adequate provision of palliative care funding, especially in regional and remote areas before this legislation is passed. Voluntary assisted dying should not be traded off for more funding. It needs to stand on its own merits, and we need to have the maturity to build an integrated and responsive approach to end-of-life care. Palliative care practitioners need to embrace an opportunity to consider how we might do things differently into the future, recognising that the government is putting additional funding of over $41 million over the next 4 years, with a total commitment of $206 million, including enhanced community palliative care. I hope this sketches out a sense of direction for how I think palliative care needs to evolve around a partnership between health practitioners and the community that is person-centred in order to build a responsive and better system. This is a concept well supported in the recent literature examining palliative care practice. I believe the bill we are debating is based on compassion, concern, love, and provides choice for people who are experiencing intolerable suffering and who are dying to have a different kind of death. A choice which does not have to resort to people taking their own lives and in so doing leaving a legacy of trauma. A choice which does not involve hazy notions of terminal sedation over a prolonged period or death by dehydration. Quality community and hospital-based palliative care sits side by side with voluntary assisted dying. It is not an either-or. It is not about one system to the detriment of another. It's about genuine choice that puts the patient first. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker.
The member